Today, we're going to dig into a hidden connection that honestly changed everything about human history. It's the link between how our beliefs evolved and how our wars were fought. We're going to see how a revolution that happened inside the human mind completely reshaped the battlefields of ancient civilizations.
Okay, so let's start with this central mystery. Think about it, right? We've all learned about wars that were fought over a piece of land or some valuable resources. And yeah, they end, the maps get redrawn, and life, for the most part, moves on. But some conflicts, they're just different. They don't just change the maps, they can erase entire cultures, forge brand new identities, and completely alter the fabric of civilization. So what makes them so different?
And this comparison right here, it frames the puzzle perfectly. On one side, you have a classic war for land. Egypt and the Hittites battling it out for control of some super valuable trade routes. The result? A peace treaty. Borders moved a bit. But on the other side, you get a war for belief, the Christianization of Egypt. Now the goal here wasn't just territory, it was the total replacement of an entire worldview, of the old gods. The result was a profound, irreversible cultural revolution. That's the difference we're diving into.
To really understand this massive shift, we first need to set a baseline. So let's look at the oldest, most straightforward reason humans have ever gone to war. Pure, simple, material gain.
We call these thematic drivers. You can think of them as the hardware of conflict. It's all the practical stuff, controlling fertile land, locking down trade routes, demanding tribute from your neighbors, and grabbing strategically important territory. It's pretty predictable, and for a very long time, it was the main reason empires bothered to go to war at all.
And I mean, you see this absolutely everywhere in the ancient world. That huge clash between Egypt and the Hittites, it was all about who controlled the money flowing through those Syrian trade routes. The initial spark for the massive Greek and Persian wars, it really came down to who controlled what territory and who had to pay tribute. And over in India, the absolutely brutal Kalinga War was basically an economic move by the Mauryan Empire to lock down its power. These were, at their core, wars about who gets what.
But here's where it gets interesting. At the exact same time all these wars were being fought for land and loot, a much quieter but far more profound revolution was taking place. And it wasn't happening on any battlefield. It was happening inside the human mind.
So in Persia, the teachings of Zoroaster completely transformed their religion. It wasn't just about appeasing a bunch of different local gods anymore. Suddenly, all of history was reframed as this grand, cosmic struggle between a single force of good and truth, Ahura Mazda, and a competing force of evil and lies. This meant that human choices, your choices, had eternal consequences.
You see a similar kind of shift in Egypt, where the cult of the god Osiris just exploded in popularity. And it brought with it this radical new idea, the afterlife. It wasn't just for the pharaohs anymore. No, now everyone would face a moral judgment, where their heart would literally be weighed against a feather. Your ethical behavior in this life, not your rank or your wealth, decided your eternal fate.
Meanwhile, the Greeks, they took a different path. Thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, they started to question the old myths. They began to turn away from the petty, all-too-human gods on Mount Olympus and started searching for universal truths, for logic, for ethics, for a rational order to the entire cosmos. They were looking for something higher, more abstract.
And believe it or not, the same kind of evolution was happening in India. The old Vedic religion, which was all about complex rituals that only priests could perform, started to give way to these powerful new ideas. You get concepts like karma, the idea that your actions have moral consequences that ripple across lifetimes, and the ultimate goal of personal liberation, or moksha. These ideas became central to new ways of thinking like Buddhism and Jainism. So here's the crucial point. There is a clear pattern emerging here. Across all these completely different cultures, religion evolves. It tends to start as a set of rituals, sort of a technology to keep the universe in balance. Then the focus shifts to ethics and morality. And finally, it becomes universal, offering truth and salvation to absolutely anyone, anywhere. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from.
And what's really mind-blowing is that these weren't just a few isolated events. As you can see from this table, these massive revolutions in thought were happening in parallel all across the ancient world. Yeah, the timelines are a little different, but the overall trend is just undeniable. Humanity, as a species, was going through a massive cognitive upgrade.
So, what happens when this new, ethical, universal way of thinking crashes head-on into the old resource-based reasons for war? Well, the results are explosive.
These new belief systems created something incredibly powerful and, frankly, very dangerous. Ideology. All of a sudden, you had an identity that went way beyond your city or your tribe. You belonged to a community of belief, a universal truth. And that truth, well, that truth was worth fighting for. It was worth dying for, and it was worth killing for. Wars suddenly got a second engine, a powerful new fuel that could burn hotter and longer than ever before.
Okay, so now we can put all the pieces together. We can actually map this entire history and see the exact moment these two powerful forces, the thematic and the ideological, really began to resonate with each other.
So here's the big question. What does it actually look like? What happens when you take centuries of human conflict and you overlay it with the peaks of these huge religious and philosophical revolutions?
This timeline reveals the whole story. Look at the early period, way back around 1500 BCE. It is a sea of green. Wars are almost entirely thematic. They're about land, resources, tribute. But as we move forward, especially after about 500 BCE, you see more and more red and orange pop up. Ideology starts to frame the conflicts. And by 500 CE, with the rise of major universal religions, ideology becomes a huge driver. By 1000 CE, the transformation is complete. Ideological wars don't just move borders anymore, they reshape worlds.
Let's actually put a number on that. In the early age of empires, let's say from roughly 3000 to 1000 BCE, our analysis shows that a massive 80% of major conflicts were driven primarily by those thematic economic concerns.
And here's what that looks like visually. It's crystal clear. That bar for thematic drivers just towers over the tiny little bar for ideological ones. In the beginning, war was overwhelmingly about stuff. Ideology, if it was there at all, was mostly just a minor justification.
But now, let's jump forward in time. By the medieval era, that balance had completely, totally shifted. For many of the world's most significant conflicts, ideological drivers had grown to become the majority force, over half of the motivation to fight.
And this chart just shows that dramatic flip. Look at it. The ideological bar is now the dominant one. The very nature of war itself had been transformed. Belief had become a primary reason to fight, and that fundamentally changed the intensity, the scale, and the stakes of human conflict forever.
So, what does this all mean? What's the big takeaway? It means that the most world-changing events in history don't happen because of just one thing. They happen when these two different dimensions, the material and the ideological, start to vibrate at the same frequency.
This quote from the source material just says it all perfectly. The most transformative, civilization-shattering conflicts happen when that thematic driver for material gain and that ideological driver for absolute truth align perfectly. When you're fighting not just for land, but for your God, for truth with a capital T, for salvation itself, that's when history gets rewritten.
And that leaves us with one final, crucial question that brings it all right back to today. This pattern, it didn't just stop in the ancient world. So when you look at the global landscape right now, where do you see them? Where do you see those straightforward, thematic conflicts over resources? And where do you see those powerful, ideological conflicts over belief, identity, and truth? And more importantly, where do you see them resonating together? Because that's where our world is being shaped as we speak.